This is the ruling of the court. This is an application for review of the ruling of the ordinary bench of this court dated 16 February 2021. At the close of the case of the petitioner on 8 February 2021, counsel for first respondent and the second respondent also announced the closure of their respective cases and invited this court to determine the petition on the basis of the evidence the petitioner had adduced in this petition and their earlier preliminary objections that the petition discloses no reasonable cause of action. Counsel for the petitioner filed an application for leave of court to reopen the petitioner's case by calling the chairperson of the first respondent to testify in her personal capacity through the process of subpoena and be treated as an adverse witness. In that application, counsel for the petitioner submitted that he was invoking the inherent jurisdiction of the court on account of there being no specific rule of court to support the application being urged on the court. In his supporting documentation, it was the position of counsel for the petitioner that the chairperson of the first respondent had sworn to affidavits in which he had made the positions to the effect that he would be available for cross-examination. According to counsel for petitioner, these were the positions or notes which the chairperson of the first respondent ought to be bound by. He submitted that in law, the statement that he was available for cross-examination was to be conclusively presumed against her under Section 26 of the Evidence Act 1975 NRCD 323, and this should form the basis on which the court should order her to testify as a witness for the petitioner. He submitted further that it was the intention of petitioner to call her as an adverse witness pursuant to Section 72 of the Evidence Act. Counsel for petitioner failed to indicate to the court the nature of the subpoena he intended to issue and what kind of testimony exactly he was expecting the chairperson of first respondent to bring to his aid in her personal capacity. It must be understood that under Order 38 Rule 10 Sub 1, the writ of subpoena a party may issue to invite a witness may be a subpoena ad testificandum to compel the witness to testify, or ad tecum to compel the party to produce documents in support of the party's case. Counsel for petitioner variously said that the chairperson of EC is to testify to the court on the truths behind the errors that the petitioner has outlined from her declaration in his petition, and also to account for how she conducted her constitutional duty as a returning officer for the presidential elections, particularly with the final collation of voting returns resulting in the Form 13 and the CI 127. This application to reopen his case for the sole purpose of issuing a subpoena to the chairperson of the first respondent to appear and testify as an adverse witness for the petitioner after all the parties had closed their cases was dismissed because the court in its ruling and the review clarified that the application was not supported by any law or settled practice. As a policy court and a court whose decision must be followed by all courts, we set out in our decision of 16th February 2021 the settled boundaries that every court must comply with if called upon to exercise their discretion and allow a party to reopen their case for the admission of new evidence. They are in two broad areas as follows. 1, would the evidence, if it had been presented during the trial, have had any influence on the result? 2, could the evidence have been obtained before or during the trial by the exercise of reasonable diligence? The review jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is properly invoked under Rule 54 of the Supreme Court Rules 1996 CI 16 and requires the satisfaction of 2 grounds. A, exceptional circumstances which have resulted in miscarriage of justice. B, discovery of new and important matter or evidence which after the exercise of due diligence was not within the applicant's knowledge or could not be produced by him at the time that the decision was given. Counsel for petitioner has asserted that it amounts to a fundamental error for this court to A, fail to find that the first respondent depositions about being available for cross-examination should be conclusively presumed against her, such that she should be compelled to testify as a witness of the petitioner. He urges that this failure to properly construe Section 26 of NRCD 323 is a fundamental error of law. He also urges that this court's construction of adverse witness by relying on the definition contained in Black's Law Dictionary instead of Section 72 of Evidence Act constitutes another fundamental error. Third, he urges that by dismissing the petitioner's application to reopen his case for the sole purpose of calling the Electoral Commissioner as a witness of the petitioner, this court is shielding her and enabling her to evade cross-examination, contrary to a position she had deposed to earlier in the processes in this petition. It is the position of counsel for petitioner that the chairperson of first respondent is required to appear and testify to the truth of what happened in the election in dispute to account to the people of Ghana for her stewardship as the returning officer of the presidential election, for which she had issued a first declaration and corrected that declaration with a press release the next day. She was also required to clarify matters arising during the cross-examination of the petitioner's witnesses. We disagree with counsel for the petitioner on all these grounds, urging alleged fundamental errors as constituting exceptional circumstances. This is a court of law and not a forum for suppositions. It must be stated that courts of law administer justice in accordance with law and settled practice, and no court can afford to lose sight of this. Further, this is the highest and the last court of the land, and our decisions on the questions of law have binding effect on all other courts. That before this court accedes to any application that is not covered by statute, the rules of court, or known general principles of law applicable in this jurisdiction, this court must ensure that it's not opening a Pandora box that can become a stepping stone for abuse of court processes at other levels of the judicial system. The interest of justice is not only the interest of one party in the dispute, but must necessarily be an outcome arrived at through the proper balance of what the law has prescribed as the duties of the court to all parties and the duties of the parties to each other. Thus, when the court has to exercise discretion in an extraordinary situation, such as a party seeking to reopen his case after all parties have closed their cases, the court has to ensure that the discretion is consistent with statute, rules regulating procedure, principles of law, and settled practice of the courts. We have earlier in this ruling set out the guidelines that all courts must follow when determining applications for leave to reopen a party's case at any time after they had voluntarily closed their own case. Applicant has urged that this court failed to appreciate the import of Section 26 of the Evidence Act, NRCD 323. This submission is misconceived because we fully appreciated the submission of the petitioner's counsel, and found them wholly unsupported by any rule of law or rule of equity to which the conclusive presumptions is made subject. It is not the case, as urged by counsel for petitioner, that we allowed Order 38 Rule 3E5 of CI 47 as amended by CI 87 to take precedence over a substantive act of parliament. The Supreme Court reviewed the legal principles on the equitable doctrine of promissory estoppel that has been captured in Section 26 of the Evidence Act in the case of Clipper Leasing Corporation versus AG and Ghana Airways in liquidation, 2016, 100 GM, 1 Supreme Court. The holding of the court clarifies that for a statement to constitute conclusive presumption, it must be a statement of fact, and it must be clear, unequivocal, unambiguous, and unconditional. The promissor must have intended the promisee to act upon it, and the promisee must show that he acted on it and altered his position. Further, all the circumstances of the case will be taken into account in granting relief, and the usual maxims of equity will apply. From this premise, the first question to ask when a party alleges that a statement must be conclusively presumed against the maker of the statement is, was the promise clear, unequivocal, unambiguous, and unconditional? Was the promise and the context of the promise such that the promissor intended the promisee to act upon it? Did the promisee show that he acted on it and altered his position? In the context of the case before us, we are satisfied that the positions in issue cannot satisfy the minimum threshold of being clear, unequivocal, unambiguous, and unconditional undertakings of the first respondent herein to defend itself in this suit. At the time the depositions were made, the first respondent had already given notice in its answer that it considered the suit as disclosing no reasonable course of action and had gone on to file its submissions with respect to that position. All three parties had filed their submissions on this point. We found this to be the most determinative factor, that these depositions cannot be construed as clear and unambiguous undertakings that could give rise to a conclusive presumption that the first respondent would be defending itself in this suit. Again, the depositions were made by the chairperson of the first respondent as a representative of a party in this suit, and not in her personal capacity as a party in the suit. The decision whether or not to testify in the suit could only be that of the commission and not hers. The decision whether or not to personally testify on behalf of the first respondent commission is also not available to the chairperson because he is not a party to this suit. Further, cross-examination is only possible if there is examination in chief. Thus, if the first respondent, which is an organization, decided after the petitioner closed his case not to defend itself, the statements made as part of an affidavit in opposition indicating the options the petitioner could exercise if the interrogatories and other applications were disallowed cannot be said to have been unambiguous undertakings to submit either the commission through the chairperson or any other officer to cross-examination in a suit that it had not offered testimony in chief. Counsel for applicant has also urged that this court failed to consider Section 72 of the Evidence Act, but rather relied on the definition in Black Law's Dictionary, and so the ruling and the review was per incuriam. We find no merit in this submission. Black's Law Dictionary is a respected and reputable source book for the bench and legal practitioners. Reference to law dictionaries is an accepted and respectable practice in common law jurisdictions, including Ghana. Furthermore, there is no inconsistency and contradiction between the definition in Black's Law Dictionary and Section 72 of the Evidence Act, as already determined by the Supreme Court. In Re Okan disease, Dodu and another, versus Okan and others, 2003-2004, one Supreme Court of Ghana report, page 582. We are satisfied that it is the nature of testimony proffered by a witness that allows a court to categorize that witness as an adverse witness or hostile witness, and not the description of the witness as such. And so the submission that the witness was to testify as an adverse witness was no answer to the need to clarify the objective of seeking leave to reopen the case and call the chairperson or the first respondent as a witness of the petitioner. Section 72 of the Evidence Act provides 72(1). Subject to the discretion of the court, in a civil action, a party or a person whose relationship to a party makes his interest substantially the same as a party may be called by any adverse party and examined as if on cross-examination at any time during the presentation of evidence by the party calling the witness. When such a witness is cross-examined by his own lawyer or by a party who is not adverse to the party with whom the witness is related, that examination is to be treated as if it was a re-examination. Clearly, the positive part of the provision in Section 72(1) is the fact that the person who calls such a witness has an interest that is adverse to that of the witness, and he is allowed to cross-examine the party he has called, and not that he merely described the witness as an adverse witness on the application to call the witness. In Re Okan disease, Dodu and another versus Okan and others, Supra, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to review the distinction between an adverse witness and hostile witness. The court was clear that being an adverse or hostile does not arise from the description given by the party who called the witness, but the nature of testimony given by the witness. First, Dr. Sechum JNC had this to say in clarification on the general nature of witnesses and the specific nature of adverse and hostile witnesses at page 599. Quote, as a result of the testimony of the third plaintiff witness, namely that he did not see either the testator or the second plaintiff witness sign the will, counsel for the executors applied for permission to treat him as a hostile witness. Learned counsel for the defendants was right when he submitted that the witness should be rather treated as adverse witness and not as a hostile one. The reason is that any attesting witness will be a witness of the court and not that of the party calling him, end of quote. Professor Kluje JSC went on to state as follows from page 626 in his evaluation of when the witness is an adverse or hostile witness and the effect of the testimonies of the two types of witnesses. Quote, the trial judge, with the benefit of observing the witness, may choose to believe an adverse witness or part of his testimony. The fact that a witness called by a party gives an adverse or contradictory testimony does not lead to the irresistible conclusion that the adverse witness is an untruthful. The witness may be an adverse witness precisely because he insists on telling the truth rather than commit perjury in support of the fabricated story of the party who called him. Usually, it is difficult to determine whether the witness is merely adverse or hostile when there is no previous statement by him with which he could be confronted. In my view, a witness is a hostile witness if it can be shown that he knows the truth but deliberately persists in lying to the court. There may be different ways of arriving at that decision, end of quote. We do not see any fundamental error occasioned by this court's evaluation of whether the chairperson will be an adverse witness merely by her description as such by counsel for petitioner, even before she brings any testimony to the court. The issue that was determined by the ordinary bench is whether it is proper for the court to exercise judicial discretion and allow the petitioner to reopen his case for the sole purpose of calling the chairperson of the first respondent as his witness by the issue of his subpoena. Our determination was that it would not be a proper exercise of judicial discretion, and we do not see the miscarriage of justice that our decision occasioned, since petitioner continues to insist on not disclosing what new material the proposed witness is to testify on, and how that new evidence can change a judgment that is yet to be given. Counsel for petitioner also contends that the ruling was in breach of Articles 19, Clause 13, and 296, as it was unreasonable and irrational. Counsel for petitioner failed to draw the court's attention to any unfair exercise of judicial discretion exhibited by the Supreme Court against the petitioner, just because the court refused his application to reopen the case he had closed and to serve a subpoena on the EC to serve as an adverse witness. He would like to reiterate a time-honored principle of the adversarial system we operate, quoting the Supreme Court in Clipper leasing case. Again, quote, the well-known policy of the law is that parties to a case in court are to know exactly what is that they are required to answer, and this is a requirement of fair hearing that the courts insist on. The requirement of fair hearing is a fundamental rule of natural justice, so a party cannot change its case on appeal when the opponent has no opportunity to adequately defend himself and lead requisite evidence in his or her defense. The petitioner purported to present his full case in the witness statement submitted after the depositions in issue had been made. On the strength of those testimonies, including that of a third witness petitioner later called, respondents closed their respective cases. If the petitioner intended to rely on the depositions in issue, the law required him to state as part of the testimonies he would rely on the specific testimonies or documents he wanted the chairperson of the first respondent that petitioner has summoned before us to produce to aid the petitioner's case on the alleged strength of the depositions. As part of pre-trial processes, the parties and this court could have had the opportunity to tell me if truly the documents were not available in petitioner's custody, as happened in the application to produce originals of the polling station results, or the testimony sought was relevant to the settlement of the matters in controversy in this petition, as happened in the application to serve interrogatories. Statutes are construed and applied as a whole. No party or court may take part of a law and urge it to be applicable while ignoring the rest of the statute. Sections 10 to 14 of the Evidence Act lays down the burden of producing evidence and the burden of persuasion squarely on the party that alleges any position of fact or issue of law. Further, we stick to the time-honored principles that the Supreme Court has adopted in circumstances in which it reviews its decisions. Thus, in the case of Mechanical Lloyd Assembly Plant versus Nati, 1987-88 Uganda Law Report 598, page 603 to 604, under DJS stated, quote, "Let me say at once that for all I know, virtually every judgment on this earth arrived at as a result of evidence gathered from several sources can be criticized. A Privy Council judgment put in the hands of any lawyer, along with the evidence grounding it, can be criticized in the same way as a High Court judgment can be. A person who has lost a case will almost instinctively feel that the judgment must be wrong. And why not? If he had won, the decision would be right. So if he lost, how could the court be right? But the mere fact that a judgment can be criticized is no ground for asking that it should be reviewed. The review jurisdiction is a special jurisdiction to be exercised in exceptional circumstances. It is not an appellate jurisdiction. It is a kind of jurisdiction held in reserve to be prayed in aid in exceptional situations when a fundamental and basic error may have inadvertently been committed by the court, which error must have occasioned a gross miscarriage of justice. The review jurisdiction is not intended as a try-on by a party after losing an appeal, nor is it an automatic next step from appeal. Neither is it meant to be resorted to as an emotional reaction to an unfavorable judgment. Secondly, in Chapel Hill versus Attorney General and another 2010 Supreme Court of Ghana report, page 827 at 850, the Tiban JSC further set out the parameters for reviews as follows, quote, "I do not consider that this case deserves any lengthy treatment. I think that it represents a classic case of a losing party seeking to re-argue its appeal under the garb of a review application. It is important that this court should set its face against such endeavor in order to protect the integrity of the review process. This court has retreated several times without number that the review jurisdiction of this court is not an appellate jurisdiction, but a special one. Accordingly, an issue of law that has been canvassed before a bench of 5 and on which the court has made a determination cannot be revisited in a review application simply because the losing party does not agree with the determination. This, unfortunately, is the substance that the current application before this court is." End of quote. The application and the review was dismissed because it was not based on any known law or rules of practice. We dismiss the instant application as being wholly without merit.
As the court pleases. You are grateful to the court.
We are most grateful.